Hello and welcome to the Three Will Podcast. This is your host, Danny Ryan, and I have Pete Skelly here with me. He is our Director of Technology, yes?
That's correct.
Director of Technology.
That's what they call me today.
You take the technology and you direct it in certain ways. Is that what you do?
Some would say that.
Some would say that. This is going to be a really fun podcast because Pete is in the delirium stage at this point right now. So what better than to sit down, record it for posterity, and so when your grandkids are listening to this, they're like, Papa, what are you talking about? I don't understand what you're talking about. You sound silly. Seriously, today we wanted to talk about a subject that we covered in the Morning Brew. A Morning Brew is something we do weekly where we sort of do knowledge sharing within Three Will. And this week you covered Azure Functions, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Hit that and tell me at a high level. Assume I was there and listening, or maybe I wasn't listening, and you're going to describe this to me at a high level.
Azure Functions, I don't even know what the Microsoft marketing terminology and speak is at this point, but Azure Functions to me really are a pure function, if you will, and not in the proper use of pure function. Don't send me hate mail. It's just the functionality that you want to run.
Okay.
There's no additional need to have a full-blown Visual Studio project or, all this extra cruft to accomplish a typically small task. There's a whole lot of caveats around that, but that kind of boils down. You've got something you want to accomplish. It can be chunked very small, and it's kind of an in and out function that achieves some, valuable process.
So this is previously we take these and you'd build out an app, and this app would have a bunch of functions inside of it. And
Yep.
Here we're taking something that's when we're just putting it out there in the cloud, and something that we can interact with and do what we need to do in little bite-sized chunks.
Yep.
And they go and they do their thing, and they probably, I guess, just very specific inputs and outputs for this little guy that does his thing.
Absolutely. So Azure Functions are based on the Azure Web Jobs SDK.
Okay.
So, and please, if I misstate this, provide some comments or feedback in the
You'll be a comment
website
section.
that Danny has. So, full transparency, Azure Functions were recently released to GA.
Okay.
So myself and someone else in our free time are spending some time learning some Azure Functions. And one of the things that we started to look at was, what do you really do with them? And so the classic example is a timer job.
Okay.
So probably the biggest use of web jobs, at least from Three Will's perspective, for customers or even internal, we used web jobs for timer jobs. So we had
I love a good web job, I'll tell you that much.
So the timer job really was, I'm not even going there. The timer job really is the classic example. I have to clean out some table in a database, or I have files in some location that I want to clean out, or it's a very simple, everybody gets it, classic IT admin schedule a job to actually import a file or something.
Nice.
But in Azure Functions, it's a very simple mechanism of saying I have this little bit of code that might have to add a file or parse a file and update a database, or parse many files and update a database. And so you can create these functions that are based on HTTP triggers. So basically kind of a fire and forget mechanism, or even endpoints that might serve a mobile app or a custom app or even a SharePoint app, for example. They could be timers, they could be blob or queue based, and all of these things are just events. So an event kicks off that code, and that Azure Functions just essentially going to run and perform some action.
And this tickles you inside because one of the things that you can do is PowerShell.
So one
what's
of the
deal
things, one of the things that part of what I kind of dove into in the morning brew the other day was to try to get my feet wet with functions. Mm-hmm. You can write the Azure functions in multiple languages. So they have support for Node and C# and Bash and PowerShell, etc. And I figured, hey, PowerShell seems pretty good. And I had just read that everything went GA for Azure functions. And I also saw an article or blog post by John Liu about using the PnP PowerShell commandlets in an Azure function. So I said, why not give it a shot?
Sure.
And so using the PowerShell, using a PowerShell function, and based on an HTTP trigger, I was trying to set up a Microsoft flow from a SharePoint list to kick off an Azure function that would provision a site collection in Office 365.
Boom.
And so
it was easy, piece of cake.
Setting everything up was fairly easy, except for getting the PowerShell PnP commandlets to work. Little did I know, spoiler alert, the commandlets had been changed probably 2 weeks prior. And so everything that John had written about the names, the commandlet names were changed. So they had used star.pnp or star.spo for SharePoint Online for their commandlet names, and that caused a couple of problems. And it was something you could work around, but they recently changed it to star PnP star. So, for example, get-pnp site would get you a site collection.
Okay.
What I did not know is that had occurred, and that I had grabbed the latest code for the PowerShell commandlets and was thinking that it was an Azure function issue, because I've used the PowerShell commandlets enough in the past to know exactly what they were. It's always something simple, and I didn't know what I didn't know, and they were renamed. So in the end, it was real simple to set up. Very simple issue. Just took a little while to figure it out.
Yep.
So in the end, it was a very simple: create a SharePoint list, create a flow, and then flow has the ability to basically call out to an HTTP endpoint. And that pushed the data over to the actual Azure function. PowerShell took that data and basically provisioned the site collection and applied the site template from the PnP commandlets. So really simple exercise, but shows some of the power of Azure functions. And right now, kind of diving into some other things. There's some edges with it at this point. So learning some of the development style, some of the SDLC or ALM, depending on who you are, some of the lifecycle management ways of developing functions, deploying functions, managing them, etc.
Thank you for defining the acronyms for me. That's
so
sweet.
software development lifecycle and application lifecycle management. So, their functions are pretty. They're extremely powerful, and they're super simple to get started with. So you can literally go to the Azure functions.azure.com, and in the course of probably 20 clicks, have some pretty powerful stuff wired up.
Did you look at all? How are they pricing this? I mean, how do you license something like
this? In a nutshell, it's compute time.
Okay, compute time.
So really, it's for someone doing development, you could probably get away, learning it, you could get away with, pennies. If you've got a developer subscription or an MSDN subscription to Azure, it's not going to cost you really anything to get started. There's in the millions of compute cycles for free, basically, with an Azure subscription. If you're using, if you're processing blobs, so if somebody puts a file into a blob storage and you have a function that's kicked off because of that event, obviously you're going to pay for some blob storage, and some of the storage things are, depending on how much you're using, could get a little pricey. But to get started and to start figuring it out, very cheap.
Nice.
And also really looking at, if you have things that are that typically might be a workload where, a couple of our customers currently have a classic scheduled task running on a server in their own environment. And so they're paying for the infrastructure for the server. They're paying for the server itself. They're paying for somebody to monitor and manage it. If they've got to patch it, all of those things where literally they've got a PowerShell script that's, 50 lines of PowerShell that's running, that's doing the work. That can be moved up to Azure and actually, function in Azure. They get rid of all that cost. They get rid of all those kind of moving parts, and it just becomes somebody uploads a file to blob storage, that function runs, they get charged for the time that function's running, and they move on. Really, I think there's a lot of potential there.
Yeah.
The IFTTT mentality and Zapier mentality and now Flow, that style of interaction with things, and we wrote in a white paper many moons ago, the true power of kind of a network, if you will, are all the permutations that you have. Basically, all of those nodes, the more nodes you have, the more value you're going to get. Well, Flow just kind of, between Flow and functions and all these other things, it's now you're getting to a power user could make some really effective workflows, if you will, and I'm doing air quotes on the podcast. That's not effective.
I see the
but you can create some really powerful, sort of personal workflows using Flow. And then if there's something that need to be more enterprise grade, that's where Logic Apps would come in.
Okay.
So, in effect, Logic Apps would be the enterprise level of a personal flow, if you will. And Logic Apps basically know how to interpret, interact with. You have full access to Azure Functions, so it's the big boy movement to getting all of the business processes that would be event driven within kind of your Office 365 or Azure environment.
So someone getting started with this, besides nailing the class names, what would you
figuring out the easy stuff?
Any tips that you would have for them?
Start with functions.azure.com.
Okay.
You'll need a Azure subscription.
Okay.
But that's the simplest way to get started. The Azure Web Jobs SDK in GitHub has a ton of samples. I believe it's Chris Anderson did a Azure Functions demo or seminar or session at Ignite this year.
Okay.
And that is probably one of the better things I've seen as far as explaining what they are, how to use them, giving you some concrete examples, etc. And once you kind of go through the UI to get your feet wet, there's several utilities depending on if you're inside of Visual Studio. Me personally, I'm on a Mac, so I'm using some command line tools. So the Azure Functions command line interface actually lets you stub things out and get started kind of in a better application lifecycle management. So you're using source control, you're pushing to a repository.
Nice.
That's actually going to, once you push it, check your code into master, it actually deploys it out to the function. So get a little bit more advanced once you get out of the UI in the web. You got to get some tooling, and so that's not there yet. It's kind of half-baked. There's some really good stuff out there, but it takes a little effort. That's kind of the stage I'm in, is getting the pieces and parts together so that you're actually doing the development, quote, properly versus trying to go through a UI and not being really scalable. Not that there's not value in that, but for our customers, we've got to find a way to actually make that a little bit more ALM compliant. So
when do you see, first, and we're getting here to the latter stages of this, I'll need to let you get back to work here. When do you see first using functions on projects, or Azure Functions on projects? Are you next project you're going to be on, or is it,
I think the dependency right now is, does the customer have Office 365 first off? If they have Office 365, I think that's the easiest on-ramp, because then it's just, okay, you've got Office 365, let's get a subscription in Azure and basically wire up some processes. So one of our customers that I'm working with currently, that's in their plan for 2017.
Great.
So they're really looking forward to kind of doing some of the things I described, which are kind of timer job based on premises, and moving those into the cloud and using just pure compute, so they're not they don't have servers on prem anymore, those types of things.
Do you mind taking a couple hours this weekend and getting the Jive migration tool over into this functions? I'm sure somebody
Actually, the reason I'm a deer in the headlights today is because I'm working on, I've been mired in Git for most of the day, trying to set it up so that we can have multiple Git repositories that share all the same code. So I'm working on your migrator tool right now as we speak.
Thank you.
So
Very
it's
nice.
coming.
Very nice.
I don't know if it'll be in Azure Functions very soon, but that's kind of the long-term goal for some of this stuff.
You focus in on getting the project done. I'm like the number 18th priority around here, so I understand that. I know where I fit into the world. Well, with that, thank you so much for taking, especially at the end of the day here, taking some time out just to share, share internally at the earlier this week, and then sharing with everybody here. If you're picking this up and have any questions, please leave a comment at the bottom of the page. Also, promote your website, Pete.
PeteSkelly.com. The Azure Functions blog post that actually goes through what I had to do to get the PnP commandlets working, full code, those types of things are all out there. So
yeah, and I'll put a link to that at the bottom of the page as well. So jump off there is a good next step from here. And thank you so much for listening, and have a wonderful day. Take care. Bye-bye.